U.S. Moves forward in any kind of military way. Now, the Iranians are significantly weaker than they were before, but they've still showed tremendous resilience and ability to get certain missiles off, especially on sites that are not well protected. And I think the Gulf nations are particularly concerned about their own energy infrastructure. They also are working behind the scenes, as you know. It's not just Pakistan and the Omanis and others that are working. The Iranians, there are messages being conveyed back and forth via the Gulf nations to Iran. So, like I said before, we don't know how this is going to play out, but you can see that that the Gulf nations, especially Saudi, didn't want. They thought that there was another path, and maybe this is the one. We'll see.
And Trina, to you, why do you believe that Saudi Arabia wants restraint? What is its biggest concern?
I think the Admiral is absolutely correct. I think the Saudis, frankly, don't have confidence in any of the American military plans, and they know that that type of escalation will only lead to a counter-escalation by the Iranians in which the GCC states will be the biggest victims. And because they don't have confidence that the U.S. has a winning military strategy, all that would lead to is more suffering for them without actually changing the facts on the ground or changing the direction of this conflict. So it's all loss, no gain.
We begin in the Middle East, where the imminent U.S. attacks on Iran have been cancelled for now. President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social saying, based on a request from Iran and other Middle Eastern countries, quote, I have agreed for the future benefit of the world and likewise the survival of a successful and prosperous Iran to cancel the attack, subject to being able to rapidly make a deal. President Trump's announcement comes after CNN learned that he and the Saudi Crown Prince spoke on Saturday. Sources tell us Prince Mohammed bin Salman discussed de-escalation efforts and raised concerns about the plans for new U.S. strikes on Iran. NPR reporter Arzu Rezvani joins us now from Los Angeles. It is good to see you. President Trump says he has paused what appear to be imminent military strikes. What do we actually know about why, and what are your thoughts?
Well, frankly, I don't know what is new here. I mean, it seems like the MOU was supposed to be the perimeters of a deal, and that hasn't really held up. And Iran has continued to assert its control over the Strait of Hormuz. So the question really is this some new contours for a final deal, or is this a renewed commitment to the memorandum of understanding? There are a lot of details that are still pretty thin, and it raises a lot more questions than it does answers. I will say it's now morning in Tehran. State media is starting to report on President Trump's post and announcement. And a lot of state media, they are dismissing this. They're calling it rhetoric. They say that this is a lie. And to put this into some context, I mean, President Trump and the administration, they have in the middle of negotiations struck Iran. And they have made deals and introduced new terms to deals, as we saw most recently with Saudi Arabia and their declaration to pursue nuclear ambitions. And so there's just a great deal of skepticism in Iran right now over what President Trump is saying.
There's a lot there. Has anyone publicly confirmed any of these terms, or are we still largely hearing the U.S. version of events? What makes this different?
Yeah, we are largely listening to the U.S. version of events, and not a lot more detail has come out beyond President Trump's post.
Even with this pause, Iran has continued warning that any new U.S. attack would trigger retaliation against American interests. How much has the immediate risk of a wider regional war actually fallen over the last few hours, do you think?
I don't know that it has diminished much, to be honest. I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind with Iran is that the Iranian officials doing the negotiations aren't always in line with the Iranians who are carrying out the war. The Iranians carrying out the negotiations are under tremendous pressure by the hardline flank in Iran, in the media, in the military, in the government, not to negotiate, not to make concessions, especially when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, because they've discovered that it is such a tremendous tool for leverage. And so the members of the negotiating team are just having a very hard time knowing exactly what to take and what moves to make.
The Strait of Hormuz still remains so central to all of this. If negotiators can secure guarantees that commercial shipping can move freely again, how significant would that be?
Oh, I think it would be hugely significant because the cost to blockading or keeping ships from moving through the Strait of Hormuz has inflicted a lot of pain on the U.S. economy, on the global economy. So that's a really big push for the Americans. And I think it's not clear that the Iranians are going to budge on that front. Again, they have realized that this is an enormous tool of leverage in the ways that they don't have an upper hand on the military, and on the battlefield. They have found that they actually have an edge when it comes to the economy and inflicting economic pain. And so I don't think that we're going to see them readily give up the control that they have found.
There have been several moments over the past few months when diplomacy did appear so close, only for fighting to resume. What do you think is different this time, and what are the biggest obstacles that could still cause these talks to collapse?
Well, I think that the pressure that the Gulf states are putting perhaps on President Trump to let up a little bit, to make concessions, I think that's notable. I think the fact that Saudi Arabia has become involved and has reportedly called President Trump to ask him to rethink and reconsider additional strikes is pretty notable. I think what's different now is that the threat of striking power plants and power infrastructure is pretty notable. The fact that Iran very quickly declared that they would also retaliate by attacking power plants in the region is significant. I mean, it establishes a new kind of mutually assured destruction on the energy sector. And I think the Gulf states really can't afford that. And I think they've realized it. And I think that they're now applying some new pressure on the United States and might be also discreetly having talks with Iran to see if they can come up with some arrangements on their own if the United States and Iran can't work out some kind of an arrangement.
President Trump is warning of new attacks on Iran, which U.S. officials say could come as early as this weekend. The president said, quote, "we'll be hitting them very hard," end quote. For its part, Iran is keeping up its drone attacks on Kuwait, where the U.S. has a major military presence. Kuwaiti officials say no casualties were reported in today's attacks. CNN's Julia Benberg is following all of this. Julia, what more do we know?
The United States is planning new strikes against Iran, which could come as soon as this weekend. President Donald Trump, he is spending the next couple of days here in New Jersey at a nearby property, and he is weighing some options. What we don't know at this point is the precise scope of these strikes and the potential targets the United States might go after. And officials familiar with the planning who spoke with CNN cautioned that this could all be called off. Those officials did say that there has been planning around the option of targeting Iran's energy sites. The Trump administration has been wary of going after Iran's energy infrastructure, in part due to the concern that Tehran could retaliate by going after Gulf infrastructure and then spike global energy markets, which have already been under great strain during this conflict. Just yesterday, Trump, while speaking at a cabinet meeting that was held at Camp David, he previewed the potential of this new wave of strikes and expressed frustration in the way that diplomatic efforts have gone so far. Take a listen.
We'll be hitting them. We'll be hitting them very hard. And, at some point they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore. We just want to win. We don't want to have them. It's very simple. They cannot have a nuclear weapon.
It is important to note that throughout this now 5-month-long conflict that Trump has really gone back and forth between threatening to escalate military action and expressing hope for a diplomatic breakthrough. It does seem by his recent remarks that at least right now he is not putting a lot of hope in diplomacy. He said during those remarks that he is losing faith in Iran's leadership and that they have just been making him angry lately. We did reach out to the White House for specifics on these potential strikes, and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said this in part. She said, President Trump is not going to stand by and allow this terrorist behavior to occur. Iran will continue to pay until they can come to the table in what President Trump deems a meaningful way. But as he weighs these options and as this conflict has gone on longer than he had originally predicted after those first joint U.S.-Israel strikes against Iran, he said this could last a couple of days, then a couple of weeks. We're now months into this. Recent polling has shown that Americans are not happy with the way that this has played out. This has shown up consistently in recent polls, and a CNN poll showed that just 28% say that they approve of the way that Trump has handled this conflict. Fred.
All right, Julia Benbrook, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation now. With us now is Behnam Ben Talibou. He is the Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Great to see you, as always. All right, so the U.S. is threatening to go after energy and infrastructure. Is that rattling Iran at all?
Pleasure to be with you again, Federica. In short, I think it's a big mistake because we've been at the edge of this precipice before, where the president is threatening to widen the war, widen the target set, particularly against this sort of infrastructure. And this is a regime that even prior to the war, prior to the protests that began late December, early January, was moving the whole country towards failed state status anyway. I mean, just look at the Iranian exchange rate today and you'll get a glimpse of exactly what I'm saying. So if the president is hoping to do this, either as a threat to get the regime to blink, it hasn't blinked thus far, or to generate more pain, I think that's a lose-lose proposition. And therefore, we're in a familiar but frustrating place on this crisis.
And you say that because, you know, Trump has said things before and then not followed through or changed his mind, and that speaks to, I guess, his credibility on the world stage, and particularly in this conflict. So what is at stake for Trump, his diplomatic and military strategies, in terms of whether he does or doesn't follow through on these threats?
Well, you don't want it to be a lose-lose proposition to be able to have to strike a target that is not going to generate the political leverage that you need, either for a diplomatic off-ramp or to go against this regime in a broader, bigger way. I think not every problem with respect to the Islamic Republic needs a B-2, but many of them indeed could use creative planning, could use drones, could use the unleashing of intelligence assets, could even use, you know, running the clock on the blockade, which was America's most powerful non-kinetic tool to drive down the thing that actually funds these destabilizing missile, military, nuclear, and even drone programs. So the president has lots of options, but he's also got lots of goalposts on the field to play against. The question is which one, and that's really the art of governance. That's the art of strategy, prioritizing time, resources, and priorities. And this is a regime that sees its own survival more based on escalation than engagement right now, and they're going to try to force the president into a lose-lose option.
All right, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have said you believe that Iran wants to divide and conquer in the Middle East. So how might this conflict be helping to facilitate that?
You know, in the very early phases of this conflict, when the Islamic Republic internationalized the war by striking Arab infrastructure, hotels in the UAE, energy infrastructure in the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Jordan, even 4 times trying to fire a missile at NATO ally Turkey, for example, let alone against Israel and later drone strikes against Cyprus. I said the Napoleon quote, which is when your enemy is making a mistake, don't interrupt them. And that was an opportunity for America to shore up the pro-American order in the region. And diplomatically, sadly, we let that opportunity atrophy and go away, such that Iran is now engaging in salami slicing tactics against all our partners in the region, the weakest ones without the retaliatory capability, like Jordan, less so Bahrain and Kuwait, continue to get struck by Iranian missiles and drones. And so we're in a very rough place where diplomatically we need to be able to hold the line.
You've also said that it's not a regime change, but a leadership change in Iran. So who is calling the shots, so to speak, in that country? Is it the Revolutionary Guard or the Supreme Leader, who hasn't been seen publicly, but there have been assurances made that he does indeed exist?
Well, the Supreme Leader, that's a position and title meant to be taken rather literally, but you're 100% right that he does not exist. And the legacy of his father, of Ali Khamenei, who was the longest-serving dictator in the contemporary Middle East, his legacy was to take a personalist, authoritarian Islamist system and institutionalize it. And the rise of the IRGC, a designated terrorist organization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as an institution, means that that system cannot be decapitated. If you're going to go against it, you have to decimate it, which requires a rethink of U.S. strategy.
David, thanks. Now to the war in Iran. 2 U.S. officials say new strikes on Iran could come as soon as this weekend. Now, President Trump discussed the war at yesterday's cabinet meeting at Camp David. He expressed his anger over recently failed diplomatic efforts while threatening more military action. But U.S. officials caution any plans for potential strikes could be canceled. Joining me now is CNN Global Affairs analyst Kimberly Dozier. Kimberly, good to see you here in Washington as I'm up for the weekend. So let's start here with this potential for more strikes. 4.5 months ago, the president said that Iran was defeated militarily. They declared Operation Epic Fury a success, victory, and it's over. But more strikes. What is persuasive at this point? What targets would make sense that could move the needle on this one way or the other?
Well, from the military's perspective, they're asked for a plan and they give one. So Central Command has presented a plan that would target energy infrastructure that is presumably to hurt Iran economically and rob its will to fight, and also missile capability to rob its actual munitions to keep it from being able to target Jordan, the Gulf, etc. The problem is they started with 6 weeks of heavy bombing. That didn't degrade their will. The people who've replaced all those who were killed have proven to be more extreme and more committed to violence. So a lot of folks in the national security world are saying this is throwing, good money after bad. It's not going to change Iran's mind.
So we get reports from Kuwait that they say that they intercepted drone strikes from Iran after Iranian aggression. There's a UK monitor that says there was a strike on a vessel right at the start of the Strait of Hormuz as well. We see these while the president says that Iran is begging for a deal. Now, the diplomatic and military path can be parallel and not resemble one another. It doesn't mean that there aren't diplomatic advances. But is there any indication that they are any closer to a diplomatic solution, that they're any closer to even getting to the table again?
Absolutely none right now. The question is President Trump conflating the pleas from various Gulf allies to keep trying with talks? Because Saudi Arabia just sent their defense minister, who reportedly asked Trump to back off the war. They want to tamp things down. Is he conflating that with Iran's desire to resolve something? From the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps side of things, the extremists who've taken power in the military, who are more extreme reportedly than the last set, they don't see a point. They don't want to give President Trump, the man who killed their supreme leader, any sort of diplomatic victory. And they also see that every time they ratchet up any pressure on Trump and his administration, it results in higher prices. And they can see through President Trump's social media posts, et cetera, that the pressure is getting to him. So for them, they feel like they can take the pain, and it's producing the kind of results that they want in terms of pride and also in terms of maintaining their control on the Strait of Hormuz.
U.S. war on Iran. 2 U.S. officials say new strikes on Iran could happen as soon as this weekend. President Trump called his cabinet for a meeting at Camp David in Maryland yesterday. He ratcheted up the pressure on Iran by threatening the strikes as he weighs his next move.
We'll be hitting them. We'll be hitting them very hard. And, at some point they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore.
In the meantime, Iran targeted an air base in Kuwait yesterday. That's according to Iranian state media. But Kuwait said it intercepted Iranian drones that targeted the country's military facilities and civilian vehicles.
The president says he now has an understanding with Israel to begin implementing a peace deal in Gaza. The agreement, which he announced last night, would require Israeli forces to withdraw and, crucially, for Hamas to give up its weapons. Though it is more complicated than that. The president does say Israel is on board.
I do have an understanding with Israel. Israel is very happy about it. Israel helped us. And they've been very good. They've been very good about it. Most people said that would be a deal that would be undoable. Now, will it go through its ups and downs? It's a very complex situation over there. The people are very complex and difficult. Many cases wonderful, in many cases not so wonderful. but that will be it's a great breakthrough. Nobody thought that would be possible, to disarm Hamas.
Brett McGurk joins us now. He helped lead talks in 2 ceasefire and hostage release agreements in Gaza. He details his experiences in a new book out later this year. It's titled Brink, Inside the Race to Free the October 7th Hostages. Brett, given your experience in negotiations just like this one, it's great to have you on tonight. Do you see this as a genuine breakthrough?
Well, Jim, I could poke 10 holes in this and describe all the reasons why it's going to be difficult, but look, something has changed here. So back in November, the UN Security Council endorsed what was President Trump's 20-point plan, and it has now broad backing throughout the region, including Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, which has really influence on Hamas, and Saudi Arabia, UAE, everybody else. Everybody is now on the same page, Jim. And one of the fundamental preconditions of that plan, endorsed by the UN Security Council, is that Hamas has to give up power in Gaza. It's unconditional. They have to cede power in Gaza to an interim Palestinian Authority, including giving up their weapons. That's something Hamas has never even contemplated really doing. And what you have now, what was agreed last night, is the implementation plan for this. And it's coming now because a lot of preconditions have been put in place. The plan calls for an interim technocratic Palestinian Authority to take charge in Gaza. That body has been established. It talks about an interim international security force. You now have troop contribution commitments from Indonesia, Morocco, Kazakhstan, a few other countries with Egypt and Jordan, and of course the U.S. would be helping with this. And you have now the roadmap for Hamas ceding its authority. So that is hugely significant. And with that, Jim, is a phased process for the Israelis to withdraw from Gaza. So that's a key piece of this as well. And the deal talks about ultimately a pathway, and this is getting way down the road, a pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. So this is the path. There really is no other plan. It's endorsed broadly by not only the UN Security Council, but all the players in the region. And, you know, I wouldn't count out those who are working so hard on this, including Nikki Milanov, who's a special representative who's kind of driving this. So, Jim, we'll see. It's not going to be linear. It's going to be hard, but it's worth a shot.
For sure, it's worth a shot. But the trouble is that you have two parties here that have to give up something that they haven't been willing to give up yet. In Israel, it is the ability to carry out further military action there, to hold on to significant pieces of territory in Gaza. And for Hamas, it's its weapons, right? So what is the leverage? Well, what's the enforcement method and what's the leverage that both those parties do that?
Well, first, the phase deal is that Israel does not begin that phase withdrawal unless Hamas lives up to its commitments. Right. The sequencing is going to be tough there, Jim. It's always a sequencing issue. And look, on the Israeli side, I mean, they have now taken out almost every Hamas leader, the Sinwar brothers, Marwan Issa. You can kind of go through them all. And Hamas has a new leader, Khalil Haya, who was one of the counterparts in the mediation we used to do, who's a little bit more pragmatic. But Hamas has been so battered. But let me say one big caveat here, Jim. Israel's heading into a really pivotal, decisive election on October 27th. Netanyahu is already getting hit from left to right. The extremists in his cabinet are saying this deal is not in our interest. And Netanyahu's rivals who are running against him in the election are also criticizing the deal. So I think it's going to be real tough before that election to really get significant traction. That election is going to be pivotal, Jim. I'm hopeful you can get a different Israeli configuration, different Israeli government. That opens up a lot of space, political space. Until then, it's going to be hard.
Before we go, we do have CNN's new reporting tonight that the U.S. is planning fresh strikes on Iran as soon as this weekend, perhaps expanded. You know, the president has talked about hitting them really hard, although he has used similar phrasing before. Do you see a fresh round of strikes, even an expanded round of strikes, as fundamentally changing the dynamic in this war right now and breaking what has really been a stalemate?
You know, I've never been in favor of telegraphing your punch, so it's a little odd if we're about to do this to be talking about it on the Friday night beforehand. Look, after this war's now, we're in the 5th month, so it's hard to see how a significant escalation is going to fundamentally change things. But Jim, Iran is feeling pressure too. I think the U.S. is in a very tough spot. Iran's also in a difficult spot. The blockades back in place. I think they really overreached. They had a good deal with the MOU, broad sanctions waivers. Now those sanctions are back in place. And I think the White House is here signaling once again to Iran, hey, let's get to the table and do a deal. The problem you come back to is the power that has consolidated in Tehran is the Revolutionary Guard, and they do not want to do a deal with the United States. One more thing about those guys, they don't want Hamas to do this deal either. You know, they want their so-called axis of resistance to hold very firm. And the fact that Hamas took this step, I don't want to read too much into it, but suggests Iran might be not as strong as it's projecting. We'll see. But I get concerned about a new military escalation because Iran still has cards. They got the missiles and drones, and they can hit throughout the Gulf, as we've seen. And of course, our troops are out there. Got to be thinking about them.
Breaking news as we come on the air tonight. CNN has learned the United States is planning new strikes on Iran as soon as this weekend. Now, sources say the precise scope of the attacks and the potential targets the U.S. may go after aren't clear at this hour, but U.S. Central Command has prepared options and readied its forces for expanding the war, including a heavy 2-week bombardment of Iran's missile sites, as well as options that would target key energy infrastructure. Now, I should note here, 2 U.S. officials cautioned nothing is set in stone and did say the strikes could ultimately be called off. But as the cameras rolled for the first ever cabinet meeting televised live from Camp David today, the president appeared to shed some light on what he thinks the path forward in Iran should be as this war enters its 6th month.
We've seen these strikes between Iran and the United States in the past 10 days. How do you go about reviving the ceasefire and getting diplomacy back on track? Well, I think we just want to win. You know, we just want to win. We're doing very well. We're trying to be nice as you can be in, you know, a situation like that. But, you know, they're being decimated. We'll be hitting them. We'll be hitting them very hard. And, you know, at some point they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore.
Now, asked about reports that Trump had ordered a new round of weekend strikes, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said in a statement, President Trump is not going to stand by and allow this terrorist behavior to occur. Iran will continue to pay until they come to the table in what President Trump deems a meaningful way. Now, with the midterms less than 100 days away, some Republicans hope that happens sooner rather than later. For now, though, the president has not found an off-ramp, something that is clearly frustrating him.
We'll talk about nuclear. And we'll be in there talking about nuclear for 7 hours. I say, why do you need 7? You can take 10 minutes. You have 5 minutes. You should solve it. But 7 hours, and then they'll go out, and I'll say they discussed nuclear. And they'll go out and they'll say, we never discussed nuclear. And I say, why do they say that? All they do is make me angry. I'm losing faith in them because they do lie and they do misrepresent. Well, the other day, the 5 missiles were shot. We knocked them down, but we were in the midst of a negotiation. I mean, I'm waiting for Steve to call me. How's the negotiation going? And instead, I got a call from Pete that they just shot 5 missiles at one of our bases in Jordan.
My lead sources tonight, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence Beth Sanner, Bloomberg's White House correspondent Jeff Mason, and the New York Times White House National Security correspondent David Sanger. Good to have all of you here tonight. Beth, when we look at where things stand, if these previous U.S. strikes were not enough, right, to get Iran to the table, is there any indication that a broader campaign and more intense campaign would have that effect?
No, I mean, that's the simple answer. You know, I understand the frustration. The Iranians have been incredibly frustrating people to deal with over the years, and now we have even harder line people in charge, right? This revelation, which I find kind of shocking that it's a revelation that the IRGC is in charge, is, you know, we've been talking about that for months. Yes, they're in charge. And so these are going to be very difficult people. But I also think that, you know, the whole lack of trust between the United States and Iran didn't just start now. So the president's shock that they would fire upon us when we were in negotiations, well, that's exactly what we did to Iran twice. We were in negotiations. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in negotiations, and we bombed them. And so, you know, I think that this lack of kind of understanding about how we are understood, you know, a key part of negotiations is actually being able to understand how the adversary thinks, and we clearly don't. So no, that's the short answer. It will not lead them to capitulation.
David, to Beth's point, that lack of understanding, right, in terms of the U.S. perhaps and the delegation who is doing this negotiating doesn't understand the people that they're dealing with. I mean, this is not the first time that has come up. There has been a frustration, as we know, about who is being sent to do some of this work and the lack of expertise there. Is there any sense that this will change who is doing some of that negotiating for the U.S.?
No, I think the negotiating team, the president's pretty well set because he wants to go with people he trusts. And he's got Steve Witkoff, who is a friend of his from back in New York real estate days. He's got his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And these are the people who he believes he sends out because the Iranians know that they are truly speaking for the president. But that said, I think Beth has really gotten at the key issue here, which is we tried 38 days of bombing on the theory that this would get the Iranians to, as the president said, cry uncle. They didn't. There was a pause, negotiations, a 14-point deal that fell apart quite quickly, partly because it was worded, I think, pretty loosely, and the Iranians drove through those loopholes to try to close off the strait successfully. And then we did 13 more days, and I'm not entirely sure what the theory of the case is that bombing them again for a couple of days or a couple of weeks is going to result in a different outcome. Clearly, they are being driven by something other than the desire to just get the frozen funds unfrozen and the sanctions lifted.
Well, and some of, Jeff, some of the CNN's reporting that the Saudis were telling President Trump, telling the administration this week that this is actually Iran's plan, right? Just to keep escalating. And it seems that is working. When all that's coming into play, I mean, President Trump mentioned what happened in Jordan, the concerns about U.S. forces in the region. What is your sense of how much that is figuring at the forefront of the decisions that are being made?
Well, it's hard to answer that. I mean, I think that they're taking all sorts of things into mind, but it's clear that the president, I mean, just listening to the president's quote again today saying, we want to win. Mm-hmm. This is a president who uses that paradigm for all things, whether it's the economy, whether it's an election, in this case, whether it's a war. And sure, he takes these other things into account, but the bottom line is he doesn't want to walk away from this conflict without being able to declare himself the winner. And Iran has made that very difficult because they keep undermining his plan. They undermine the MOU that he felt was an exit plan. That didn't turn out to be that way. So now he's really been hamstrung by that as he both A, wants to declare victory, and B, no doubt wants this to end because you've got the midterm elections coming up in November.
Right, and even just based on what we heard from him in the beginning of this conflict, right, when it started, I think it's safe to say the president did not expect we would be going now into a 6th month here.
No doubt.
No, right.
And also, it's interesting sort of what he's telegraphing in this moment, right? And what we're hearing from some of the reporting tonight that we have heard in the past, the president has said in the past, talked about energy infrastructure, maybe talked about bridges, but the fact that this could be perhaps in a more substantive way on the table, Beth, that could change things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's actually a risk that this is going to get worse. And that's my big concern. One of the points of discussion is that maybe Israel would join us in this strike. Wow, that would be a bad idea, in my view.
Why?
Because that really, again, expands it regionally. So Iran, Tasman News tonight said, one of the Iranian official news stations said tonight that if that happens, then we will be attacking Israel again. Now, we've just made, actually, I'm very congratulatory of the administration for all the work they're doing on Lebanon. Well, that could take that whole thing off the table and we could see Hezbollah back in the game, right? Because we have the Iraqi militias in the game. We have the strike on the U.S. LNG tankers off of Egypt. So we're seeing things happening now that are, horizontally expanding and vertically escalating as well. And so, this strike would be vertically, but we don't want this kind of more regionalization. We're trying to contain and focus on getting the strait open. This is not it could be a problem.
And I would add to that an escalation on the U.S. side, in terms of if past is prologue, does not lead to a crying uncle on the Iranians.
No.
So that escalation is probably only going to lead to more escalation from the other side. And that means there's really no end in sight.
Yeah, they're going to strike back at the Gulf, no doubt.
Right.
And plus Israel, if they join in.
So as we're watching all of this play out, another point of frustration, or perhaps maybe a wall that the president is coming up against, involves Todd Blanche, of course. Republican senators John Cornyn, Tom Tillis, really digging in against that nomination for Attorney General over the administration's refusal to formally kill in writing the president's $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund, and also provide assurances about certain tax investigations. So I just want to play part of what the president had to say about that earlier today.
Just to be clear, do you agree with the acting attorney general that the anti-weaponization fund is dead? And why not just put that in writing?
It is dead, but I wish it weren't, to be honest with you. I think people were horribly treated, horribly abused. This has nothing to do with Todd. This was me. Horribly abused. And I'd like to see them compensated for the pain.
It is dead. I wish it wasn't. There's a lot of talk about getting things in writing, David. In many ways, that may have clarified for the senators why they want that in writing.
Absolutely. Look, Todd Blanche said it was dead under oath in front of a committee. And yet, when the senators asked the Justice Department to simply put this in writing so that it represented the administration's view, they couldn't bring themselves to do it. And when he asked them to unwind the tax agreement that they've reached, which essentially gives the president and his family immunity from future reviews of their taxes and audits, they wouldn't do that either. So I think it's fairly clear that the administration is leaving open its options to be able to renounce those. And the president's making a big bet if he thinks that he can hold this over to the next Senate. It might work if he holds on to the Senate.
We are learning that the U.S. is planning to launch fresh strikes on Iran as soon as this weekend. That comes as President Trump gathered his cabinet at Camp David while the administration tries to find an off-ramp from the war. Two U.S. officials say the scope of the strikes and potential targets are not clear, and they could still be called off. The U.S. officials say the military has prepared options and readied its forces for expanding the war. President Trump signaled that the fighting is unlikely to stop anytime soon.
Iran is doing very poorly. Just in case you read incorrect stories, they're doing very, very poorly. They're having a hard time. We'll be hitting them very hard. And at some point they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore. All they do is make me angry. You just make me angry. I'm losing faith in them.
For more, we're joined now by CNN national security analyst Alex Plitzas with us live. He's also the director of the counterterrorism program at the Atlantic Council. Alex, what are you hearing in terms of the latest potential for strikes from your sources?
Hearing that the strikes are quite likely, and it's because, as you correctly characterized in the introduction, the members of the national security apparatus in Iran are digging in their heels, particularly members of the IRGC and the Supreme National Security Council, who don't want to return the Strait of Hormuz to pre-war conditions and have been pushed back against the deal that civilian negotiators had come to an agreement on. So it looks like a package of strikes may be possible in the coming days.
What do they strike?
So there's a couple of options that I think are on the table. A limited, shorter series of strikes that's designed just to take out additional infrastructure as sort of a warning message to get people back to the table, because the president already warned about 10 days ago or so that if Iran misbehaved again, that's what would happen. And moments ago, a tanker off the coast of Oman was struck by a projectile. So it looks like there may have been another attack by Iran just now, which is a clear message back to the United States. There could be some more substantive strikes across the country, or return to the remaining balance of the targets that were not struck before the ceasefire, somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000. That could be several weeks worth of targeting, and then also focus strikes on the remaining missile balance, because as we know, our colleagues at CNN reported correctly that there is that we've expended probably 2/3 of our missile interceptors for the Patriots and the THAADs, and that's what's used to shoot down the incoming missiles. And so to protect U.S. forces in the region, those would need to be taken out as well, to try to make sure that we protect not only ourselves but our Gulf allies in Israel as well.
Of course, the United States started this war working with Israel. There's also news from Israel. President Trump announcing last night that he'd made a deal with Hamas in Gaza to disarm. Today, he talked about that. Listen.
I do have an understanding with Israel. Israel is very happy about it. Now, will it go through its ups and downs? It's a very complex situation over there. The people are very complex and difficult. In many cases wonderful, in many cases not so wonderful. But that will be it's a great breakthrough.
So what is Israel saying? What is Hamas saying? And are they saying that there is, in fact, a deal?
So they are saying there's in fact a deal, and it's actually quite historic. So it's a 15-point deal, and for the first time, Hamas is committed on paper to actually handing over its weapons. Now, the specifics of this are important, as is the sequencing, and we are seeing a little bit of verbal back and forth from both sides. So there's a national technocratic committee that's been established to oversee Gaza, which means none of the militant groups are sort of running it. And so there would be a phased withdrawal from the Israelis, and tied to that as well would be a handover of weapons, whether those are completely decommissioned or whether those are stored under the administration of that new committee, remain to sort of be seen in the long run. But Hamas was making it clear they were handing it over to the committee and not the Israelis. The Israelis have made it clear that they're not going to withdraw until there's verification of the demilitarization and decommissioning of some of these major military targets that were left to be struck. So it's a little bit of fighting over the sequencing, kind of similar to the arguments we've seen between Iran and the U.S. over who does what first. But this is much further than Hamas has ever committed to on paper. So both sides really do distrust each other. So they're going to have to work through that, and the details are what's important. So good step, but a lot more to go from here.
Sources tell CNN that the U.S. is planning new strikes on Iran, as the president says, quote, all they do is make me angry. The story is botched. The Justice Department drops its case against a former Olympian accused of damaging the Washington reflecting pool, who the administration is blaming now. And the story is new danger, Russia's deadly new tactic for sowing chaos in Ukraine, bringing the war to civilians far from the front lines. We begin with this. Just into CNN, an unknown projectile has hit a tanker off the coast of Oman near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. That is according to a report received by a British maritime monitor. It did not say who was responsible for that attack. Meanwhile, we are learning that the U.S. is planning to launch fresh strikes on Iran as soon as this weekend. That comes as President Trump gathered his cabinet at Camp David, while the administration tries to find an off-ramp from the war. Two U.S. officials say the scope of the strikes and potential targets still not clear, and they could be called off altogether. President Trump signaling that the fighting is unlikely to stop anytime soon.
Iran is doing very poorly. Just in case you read incorrect stories, they're doing very, very poorly. They're having a hard time. We'll be hitting them very hard. And at some point, they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore. All they do is make me angry. You just make me angry. I'm losing faith in them.
A senior Hamas official tells CNN the militant group has agreed to give up its weapons, but only if Israel upholds its obligations under this October ceasefire agreement, which includes withdrawing its forces in Gaza and the so-called Yellow Line. Israel says it will not pull out its troops before Hamas disarms. Despite all this uncertainty, President Trump is calling that deal a breakthrough.
I do have an understanding with Israel. Israel is very happy about it. Israel helped us, and they've been very good. They've been very good about it. Most people said that would be a deal that would be undoable. Now, will it go through its ups and downs? It's a very complex situation over there. The people are very complex and difficult. In many cases wonderful, in many cases not so wonderful. But that will be it's a great breakthrough. Nobody thought that would be possible, to disarm Hamas.
CNN's Jeremy Diamond is in Tel Aviv following the latest. Jeremy.
We haven't heard anything from the Israeli prime minister about this, and a source familiar with the matter tells us that we're unlikely to hear the prime minister publicly disagree with this deal that has now emerged. But that being said, we've seen across the Israeli political spectrum, and certainly within Netanyahu's own government, concern about this agreement, a belief that it doesn't go far enough in terms of putting Hamas truly out of power and disarming Hamas. Israeli officials had previously said that they wanted wanted to see any weapons from Hamas taken out of the Gaza Strip or destroyed entirely, not stored away under the control of a Palestinian technocratic government, as is the case in this plan. And what's important to note here is that any progress on Hamas's disarmament, as agreed to in this agreement, is contingent upon Israel taking steps first to move forward and allow for that disarmament to take place. I spoke with a senior Hamas official who told me that they're not going to begin the process of disarming until Israel first abides by its commitments under this ceasefire agreement. That includes stopping the near daily airstrikes that we have seen in Gaza since this ceasefire came into effect nearly 10 months ago, killing more than 1,200 people. It also means pulling Israeli troops back to the yellow line as agreed to in October. As you know, over the last several months, Israel has been slowly taking over more territory inside of Gaza. And in the latest indication of how difficult this process is going to be moving forward, one Israeli official telling us that Israeli troops will not move in Gaza, will not withdraw away from the current version of the yellow line until Hamas disarms. That's putting things the opposite way that Hamas says this agreement should move forward. And also, frankly, U.S. and Board of Peace officials making clear that there are a number of steps that Israel must take in order for this disarmament process to begin.
Onwards, an unknown projectile has hit a tanker off the coast of Oman near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. That is according to a report received by a British maritime monitor. It didn't say who was responsible for that attack. While the Trump administration tries to find an off-ramp from the Iran war, the U.S. president gathered his cabinet at Camp David. This all comes as we are learning that the U.S. is planning to launch a new round of strikes as soon as this weekend. CNN's Kristen Holmes has more for us.
The United States is planning fresh strikes on Iran this weekend, although it's not clear what exactly the scope is going to be. Now, this comes at a time where U.S. Central Command has been preparing a number of different options. One of those options is expanding the war, and it would include a 2-week bombardment of Iranian missile sites. Another one of the options that we have heard is being prepared for is the striking of energy sites. Now, one thing to make clear, we've been down this pathway before. President Trump has said he's going to commit these strikes, and these U.S. officials who are telling us about what the preparing is to go into this weekend, they are also noting that nothing is finalized until those strikes actually happen. President Trump, he certainly seemed intent on ratcheting up the military action earlier today. Here's what he said.
We'll be hitting them very hard. And, at some point they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore. We just want to win. We don't want to have them. It's very simple. They cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Now, it feels as though the U.S. and Iran has come to some kind of an impasse, and there has to be something that happens to change the current state of play. We know behind the scenes mediators are trying to bring Iran and the United States back to the table for that negotiating. But right now, it certainly doesn't seem as though they are headed in that direction. Now, one other thing that we have learned from U.S. officials is there's been talk about potential strikes on nuclear sites, including Pickaxe Mountain. Now, that wouldn't be only Pickaxe Mountain, but that'd be one of them. This is something that experts are really divided on, just whether or not it would actually make any kind of impact. But, of course, again, we're waiting to see what actually happens over the weekend, but we are told that the U.S. as of now is planning a new set of strikes as early as this weekend. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
Well, on that, CNN national security analyst Alex Plitzer says the U.S. has a few options with these new strikes. He told us earlier what he's hearing about the possible targets.
Hearing that the strikes are quite likely, and it's because, as you correctly characterized in the introduction, the members of the national security apparatus in Iran are digging in their heels, particularly members of the IRGC and the Supreme National Security Council, who don't want to return the Strait of Hormuz to pre-war conditions and have been pushed back against the deal that civilian negotiators had come to an agreement on. So it looks like a package of strikes may be possible in the coming days. So there's a couple of options that I think are on the table. A limited, shorter series of strikes that's designed just to take out additional infrastructure, as sort of a warning message to get people back to the table, because the president already warned about 10 days ago or so that if Iran, misbehaved again, that's what would happen. And, moments ago, a tanker off the coast of Oman was struck by a projectile. So it looks like there may have been another attack by Iran just now, which is a clear message back to the United States. There could be some more substantive strikes across the country, a return to the the remaining balance of the targets that were not struck before the ceasefire, somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000. That could be several weeks worth of targeting, and then also focus strikes on the remaining missile balance, because as we know, our colleagues at CNN reported correctly that that we've expended probably 2/3 of our missile interceptors for the Patriots and the THAADs. And that's what's used to shoot down the incoming missiles. And so to protect U.S. forces in the region, those would need to be taken out as well, to try to make sure that we protect not only ourselves, but our Gulf allies in Israel as well.
A senior Hamas official tells CNN the militant group has agreed to give up its weapons, but only if Israel upholds its obligations under the October ceasefire agreement. That includes withdrawing its forces in Gaza to the so-called Yellow Line. Israel says it will not pull out its troops before Hamas disarms. Despite all of this uncertainty, President Trump is calling the deal a breakthrough.
I do have an understanding with Israel. Israel's very happy about it. Israel helped us with it. And they've been very good. They've been very good about it. Most people said that would be a deal that would be undoable. Now, will it go through its ups and downs? It's a very complex situation over there. The people are very complex and difficult. In many cases wonderful, in many cases not so wonderful. But that will be it's a great breakthrough. Nobody thought that would be possible, to disarm Hamas.
CNN's Jeremy Diamond is in Tel Aviv following the latest developments for us.
We haven't heard anything from the Israeli prime minister about this, and a source familiar with the matter tells us that we're unlikely to hear the prime minister publicly disagree with this deal that has now emerged. But that being said, we've seen across the Israeli political spectrum, and certainly within Netanyahu's own government, a concern about this agreement, a belief that it doesn't go far enough in terms of putting Hamas truly out of power and disarming Hamas. Israeli officials had previously said that they wanted to see any weapons from Hamas taken out of the Gaza Strip or destroyed entirely, not stored away under the control of a Palestinian technocratic government, as is the case in this plan. And what's important to note here is that any progress on Hamas's disarmament, as agreed to in this agreement, is contingent upon Israel taking steps first to move forward and allow for that disarmament to take place. I spoke with a senior Hamas official who told me that they're not going to begin the process of disarming until Israel first abides by its commitments under this ceasefire agreement. That includes stopping the near daily airstrikes that we have seen in Gaza since this ceasefire came into effect nearly 10 months ago, killing more than 1,200 people. It also means pulling Israeli troops back to the Yellow Line as agreed to in October. As you know, over the last several months, Israel has been slowly taking over more territory inside of Gaza, and in the latest indication of how difficult this process is going to be moving forward, one Israeli official telling us that Israeli troops will not move in Gaza, will not withdraw away from the current version of the Yellow Line until Hamas disarms. That's putting things the opposite way, that Hamas says this agreement should move forward. And also, frankly, U.S. and Board of Peace officials making clear that there are a number of steps that Israel must take in order for this disarmament process to begin.
Fending off a new wave of drone attacks, the General Staff of the Army told residents that any explosions heard are the results of interceptions. It is not clear what was targeted, and the news comes as we're learning that the Trump administration is planning to launch fresh strikes on Iran as soon as this weekend. Two U.S. officials say the scope of the strikes and potential targets are not yet clear, and they could still be called off. But President Trump signaled that the fighting is unlikely to stop anytime soon.
Iran is doing very poorly. Just in case you read incorrect stories, they're doing very, very poorly. They're having a hard time. We'll be hitting them very hard. And at some point, they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore. All they do is make me angry. They just make me angry. I'm losing faith in them.
It could be a crucial step toward achieving a lasting peace in Gaza. A senior Hamas official tells CNN the militant group has agreed to give up its weapons, but only if Israel upholds its obligations under the October ceasefire agreement. Now, that includes withdrawing its forces in Gaza to the so-called Yellow Line. Israel says it's not going to pull its troops before Hamas disarms. Now, despite all of this uncertainty, President Trump is calling the deal a breakthrough. Joining me live now is CNN's Jeremy Diamond. He is coming from Tel Aviv. Good morning to you, Jeremy. Are we already at an impasse here? Because Hamas says, we're not going to lay down arms until Israel withdraws. Israel says, we're not going to withdraw until Hamas disarms. Can this deal even be implemented?
Well, as significant as it is that these two sides were able to reach a deal in the first place, it is equally significant the number of challenges that we've already seen emerge in the hours since Hamas reached this deal with the Board of Peace. And frankly, U.S. and Board of Peace officials are quite clear-eyed, it seems, about the challenges that lay ahead, even as they were touting this as a significant milestone. Nikolai Mladenov, the High Representative for Gaza in the Board of Peace, made clear that what comes ahead is even more important than the months of negotiations that led us to this place where Hamas has agreed to hand over its weapons to a Palestinian transitional government under the auspices of the Board of Peace and with the support of the International Stabilization Force. And a lot of that stems from the fact that this is a sequenced agreement, and that just as Hamas is making clear that Israel must uphold certain commitments before it begins the process of disarming, we've also heard from U.S. and Board of Peace officials that there are commitments that Israel needs to uphold here in order for to unlock Hamas's the first steps of Hamas's disarmament, and that would include a range of things. First of all, an actual ceasefire in Gaza, rather than the near daily Israeli strikes that we have seen there that have killed more than 1,200 people in the nearly 10 months since that ceasefire went into effect. And then, yes, there is this issue of withdrawing troops from parts of the Gaza Strip. As you know, Salma, over the last several months, Israeli troops have been seizing more and more control of Gaza's territory beyond the yellow line that was agreed to back in October. And Hamas is saying that Israel must pull those troops back to the yellow line as it was agreed to in order for any of this process to begin. And already we have seen that while the Israeli government hasn't publicly commented on this yet, an Israeli official has told us that there will be no withdrawal of troops away from the current yellow line, meaning the yellow line as Israel has now drawn it through its encroachment upon additional square kilometers of Gaza's territory. And it just shows you just how difficult this process is going to be. Now, U.S. officials, including the president, have been asked whether or not they expect Israel to adhere to this agreement. All of them, including the president, have expressed some confidence that Israel will stick to the terms of this deal. One U.S. official did warn, though, that President Trump would be very, very disappointed if Israel does not. Perhaps a warning to the Israeli government should it consider not abiding by this deal. But you look at the political reaction in Israel, really across the political spectrum, opposition to this agreement shows you just what a difficult political position the Israeli prime minister is. On the one hand, is the U.S. government pressuring him to abide by this deal. On the other hand, the Israeli public, a public that's going to be voting in elections in less than 3 months, by and large, quite adamantly opposed to this new agreement.
Next to the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia is pushing for peace. The kingdom's defense minister made a trip to Washington this week to meet with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. Now, sources say that he told the president that Saudi Arabia wants the Iran war to de-escalate and that prolonging the conflict carries major risks. The high-stakes visit came just a day after the U.S. and Saudi Arabia conducted joint military operations against Iranian-linked militias in Iraq. Let's go to Hisham Al-Ghannaim. He is a non-resident scholar with the Malcolm H. Keir Carnegie Middle East Center. Good afternoon to you, first of all. Thank you so much for joining us, because we've seen almost two sides of Saudi Arabia this week. It was coordinating military action with Washington in Iraq. At the same time, it deployed a delegation of top officials to the White House to urge President Trump to de-escalate. Why is the kingdom walking this tightrope, and what is their position here?
Glad to be here. Thank you. Frankly, and taking everything that happened last week into account, and as you alluded to, I believe that the Saudis are navigating something that is genuinely very difficult. You know, the whole situation is very delicate. So hitting back at Iranian proxies in Iraq, and also building a maritime coalition for the Red Sea, and also backing up Arab states under attack. All of these at the same time, while also keeping an open and a very active channel with Tehran I think this is extremely challenging. But I sincerely think that the choice to strike Iraq while staying out of the wider conflict, if I may call it, is a very complicated choice for the Saudis, to say the least, but also a very necessary and a sophisticated choice for them. And I have to say that we're witnessing now, in my view, a significant and a qualitative change from how the kingdom has handled these situations in the past. I mean, when it comes to Iraq, for instance, for years now, Saudi absorbed attacks. It relied on diplomatic measures mainly, but I think that this approach, I mean the soft handling, have definitely reached its limits.
And when you say it's definitely reached its limits, what do you mean by that? Because Saudi Arabia says it wants de-escalation, but as you said there is a point where it cannot afford to appear vulnerable to Iran's proxies. Have we reached that threshold where we're going to see Saudi Arabia more militarily involved in this conflict, or does it continue to want to bring down the temperature?
Well, Salma, and of course, this Saudi evolving approach comes with real risk. The clearest and biggest in my mind is entering a cycle of strikes and counter-strikes that could pull the region into a worse situation than the current status quo. But I have to say, this is exactly why the Saudi response was carefully measured. It was precise, focused strikes on specific armed group sites, directly linked to the attacks on the Saudi oil installations and facilities. So there is no intent for escalation, but also, in my opinion, the Saudis will not hesitate to act if attacked again. So targeted, limited, and as they say, by the book. Not an open door to wider conflict. This is not something that the Saudis want to engage with at all, and at the current moment. But I believe also that...
And you describe this, I'm sorry to interrupt here, because you're describing this as limited and targeted. But Saudi Arabia is also facing threats from multiple fronts. I have to ask you about the Houthis, who are now threatening Saudi Arabian energy facilities, specifically Abqaq, which is the world's largest crude oil processing facility. How does the kingdom respond to multiple threats on multiple sides here?
The same is applicable to the Houthis. So the joint strikes in Iraq, I think it will send a clear message. The kingdom will respond to attacks coming from anywhere in the region. For instance, in Iraq, we know that at least 4 non-Iraqi, specifically Iranian military advisors, were killed alongside the militia fighters. So this wasn't a message to the proxies alone, whether it's the Houthis or the PMF in Iraq. I think it was a message to Tehran also. Both the militias and their supporters and backers are now on high alert, definitely. But beyond the tactical, when it comes to the strategic dimension, what I think is Saudi Arabia is building points to something bigger. And I would say a regional security order that does not depend only on any single outside power to hold it together. So we have the Red Sea Coalition, the legal record being built, the economic infrastructure, reducing dependency on contested waterways. These, in my view, are all steps or an attempt toward a gradual shift at the current moment, from the model that defined the region for the past, Selma, for 3 decades, where security was a business left to exclusively external powers to provide. Of course, the danger in that shift is that building a new security order takes time in this boiling region.
Now a CNN exclusive. Sources say that the U.S. is asking military analysts for creative and unconventional ideas to punish Iran.
The United States essentially crowdsourcing new ways to wage the war President Trump launched now in its 6th month. CNN's Kevin Liptak is joining us with details, and we're also joined by CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. And let's first go to Kevin Liptak at the White House. And Kevin, what are you learning about this?
Yeah, and it is kind of a remarkable email that I think underscores the difficulty that the administration, the White House, the military are having in trying to shake loose any concessions from Iran. You know, this war has stretched on for months, and there doesn't seem to be any indication yet that Iran is loosening its stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz, that it's willing to concede on the nuclear program. And what this official at Central Command, he was in the intelligence, they were in the intelligence branch, and what they wrote to this wide group of analysts was essentially looking for some new ideas. We are looking for new and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran, is what they wrote in this email, trying, in the words of one official, to kick off a brainstorming session to see if there were any thoughts within the broader community of analysts about some way to shake loose this war, because it has ended up at something of a stalemate. Now, what CENTCOM has said is that this is somewhat typical. They say U.S. Central Command has a long history of thinking and working in innovative ways. That's a spokesman for CENTCOM there. And they say that Admiral Cooper, referring to Admiral Brad Cooper, who's the commander of CENTCOM, in particular, reaches out to members of our great team, regardless of rank, to achieve the highest levels of operational performance possible. Now, what we don't know is what this inquiry yielded. Was there any new ideas that they brought into CENTCOM that could potentially try and move some of this along a little bit? But it is evident just by what we've seen over the weekend, President Trump threatening major escalation before pulling back, that they are still in search in a lot of ways of an avenue to bring this war to a conclusion.
Colonel, I wonder what you think of this approach. Is there a precedent for this? Is this unusual? Does this make sense?
So it's somewhat unusual at the strategic level. Now, at the more tactical level, there have been programs like the Air Force Suggestion Program, where people who are doing things like, let's say, maintenance work on an airplane, if they have a new procedure, they can get awards. They can actually get cash awards for turning in a new idea. And those ideas have often saved the military thousands, if not millions of dollars. So there is some reference there. The other thing is Admiral Cooper, the commander of CENTCOM, that Kevin was mentioning, he has had a history of doing some innovative things in some of his prior assignments, including as commander of 5th Fleet in Bahrain, which is the Middle Eastern naval force that the U.S. has and has had for many decades there in various forms. So the innovative approaches that they're seeking at the strategic level are kind of interesting, because usually that's kind of the province of a planning group, kind of the province of people who are developing war plans. We've basically gone into, I think this is kind of a tacit admission that we've gone into this war without using those war plans or moving them around in such a way, the components of those plans in such a way that we really don't have a desired end state. And this is why they're soliciting kind of a crowdsourcing effort there.
Yeah, and Kevin, what did CENTCOM tell CNN? Anything else?
Well, I think that the way they're describing it is sort of a routine measure to try and get the temperature from the people who are actually responsible for planning this war and may have some insights that didn't necessarily rise up to the level of the military brass. I think, you know, what we don't know yet is whether this has shaken anything loose. And I think what you've heard from the president today, still continued frustration at the state of diplomacy with Iran, you know, less than 24 hours after last night saying that he thought a deal was to be had on the Strait of Hormuz and that the Gulf countries were working to try and make that happen. You hear from him that state of frustration that the diplomacy is not yet yielding what he thought it would. And I think that just goes to show why the military is looking for some new ideas here, because clearly what the president has been trying is frustrating not only him, but some of the people who are trying to carry out this war in a way that hasn't yet produced what the president is looking for.
And Colonel, you know, Iran's foreign ministry says it's in talks with Oman to establish a safe, temporary, that might be the key word here, route for vessels through that critical waterway. What do you make of that? Is that something that Iranians are truly going to engage with without fees, without tolls of any sort?
Brian, I think that the idea that it'll be without fees or without tolls may be a bridge too far for the Iranians. They realize that they have a bit of leverage here. And what they'd really like is some kind of concord between Iran and Oman that would allow both countries perhaps to collect fees and to do something where they can, in essence, both control the Strait of Hormuz. But we know who the senior partner in a relationship like that would be, and that would be Iran. So the Iranians see a major advantage in even, in accordance with, their efforts with Oman. They believe that they will still have the advantage, that they will still get the monies that they think they are owed in this particular case. Of course, that contravenes international law, and so that's going to be, either we change international law as a result of this, or something else has to happen.
And Trump told reporters that there's a deal on Hormuz and then there will be a deal on the nuclear. How are you reading that?
Well, I'm skeptical, Brianna, because we've been basically at this point before, and I think what you're seeing is a desire by the president to reach those deals, which is totally understandable. The problem is that the Iranians may not be playing ball. They see that they have certain advantages here, especially when it comes to controlling the Strait of Hormuz, at least being able to make it difficult for vessels to go through the strait. And that's enough of a control lever that they have that would make it really difficult for them to negotiate any type of concession on their part. They think they still have the upper hand. They don't see themselves being forced away from anything that they've achieved so far.
Now, that answer alone is going to be very disappointing to several of Trump's allies who are trying to push the White House, push President Trump to get involved, to actually ask Miller not to run in the race. He would have to withdraw his name by Wednesday. It doesn't sound as though President Trump has any inkling to do that right now at all.
All right, Kristen Holmes for us at the White House on some of the comments made in the Oval Office, but there was also a lot of talk about Iran, and we want to break that down as well. Kristen Fontenrose is joining us, former senior director for the Gulf National Security Council, and Alan Ayer, former member of U.S. negotiating team with Iran under President Obama. And Alan, I'll go to you first. We heard in the Oval Office there the president say this is a last chance for Iran. I feel like we've heard similar rhetoric before. Are we getting closer at this point to that being truly a last chance?
No, I think we're caught in a doom loop. We've heard this many times before. President Trump has repeatedly threatened to annihilate Iran, to expand into civilian infrastructure, and then he says, oh, in fact, we're on the verge of a great triumph, so I'm going to stand down for the moment. So I think this is just like every previous time, and it's indication that the U.S. administration really is at an impasse and doesn't know what to do next.
He is saying it's the last chance. I think a lot of people watching this completely agree with what you're saying, Alan. There's a feeling that what he's threatening doesn't really carry that weight, Kirsten. He threatens these massive attacks and then pulls back on them. We saw that over the weekend. I mean, how are you seeing this moment and where we're actually headed and the kind of leverage that he has or does not have?
Well, remember that the strategy is to economically squeeze Iran with the naval blockade, not to necessarily arrive at a deal immediately and not necessarily to demolish them militarily. So he has to buy the time to apply that squeeze. And what you're watching happen is less about the mediators' activity behind the scenes, which is significant. It's about what each side is intending through their messages right now. The president needs oil prices to stay low. He's under domestic international pressure to do that. That buys him time. As long as oil prices maybe rise a little, come down a little, markets maybe get a little upset, then they calm. That buys him that economic squeeze time. Iran knows that. They know about the pressure he's under. So for them, they want to issue these ultimatums. We are not negotiating. There are no talks happening. They're trying to scare the markets. They're trying to spike oil prices. They're trying to panic economic markets because they know that makes that pressure on him worse. They think that will drive him to a deal. He thinks the ultimatums about the military end is coming are what will drive Iranian leaders to a deal because they are not concerned about the welfare of the country or the people. We've established that through ongoing operations. They're really concerned about their hold on power and their ability to leverage it. And so if he erases all of their military power or he goes in after things like the electricity grid, then they no longer have the reins of power. They can no longer exert a pressure on their populations. So they're both saying, we want a way out of this, but we think the way out is to make the other one bend the knee. Economically.
And who has the top there, because Iran also strategically is not willing to let go of control of the strait, it seems. Although there's that conversation between Iran and Oman, it's unclear whether that conversation is truly going to be fruitful, especially for other U.S. allies in the region who allegedly called the president asking for him to not attack Iran again this time around over the weekend. So where does that stand? Does Iran basically have hostage of U.S. allies right now with the strait?
Not necessarily hostage. Remember, it's not necessarily in the U.S. disinterest, if you're the administration, to have them call and make that request, because being able to say you backed off of a military operation to buy time for a deal gives you more time when that economic squeeze is taking place, is exerting, its impact on the Iranian economy.
Makes you look diplomatic.
Makes you look diplomatic. Well, now he is. He's saying, we're open to this deal. We want the negotiations to happen this afternoon. Is Iran willing to do it? So it puts them in that seat where they're now under international pressure to continue those talks. Because if they decide not to, the U.S. can say, we were pushed to this military decision because they would not make a deal and they were continuing to suffocate the international economy with their insistence on controlling the strait.
How are you seeing the issue of the strait right now, Alan, where you have Iran denying it was negotiating, as Trump is really trying to say, yes, they're spending hours negotiating, but Iran saying they're in talks with Oman to establish a safe temporary route for vessels through the strait. And then you see Saudi Arabia looking for workarounds also to deal with the Houthis. How are you seeing this?
Well, I think in this case, Iran is to be believed. They've realized that it makes no sense to negotiate with the U.S. because the U.S., in their mind, can't be counted on to deliver on their commitments. So the main negotiations going on now are between Iran and the Omanis, with the Omanis consulting with the other Gulf countries. But at least what's clear to me is that this administration doesn't do diplomacy. It doesn't have the foreign policy apparatus. It's too internally inconsistent. So it's outsourced diplomacy to others, to Pakistan and Qatar in the beginning, and now it's wanting to see how the Omanis play out in these negotiations with Iran over the strait. But the key issue, the only issue, is getting the strait open as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Because as Kirsten said, I agree 100%, it's a two clocks issue. Pressure on Iranian ports, pressure on the Strait of Hormuz. Unfortunately, this is the one where the alarm's going to go off first. Pressure on the strait.
President Trump with a new warning for Iran today, an ultimatum as he insists new peace talks are ongoing. Over the weekend, President Trump says he called off a massive attack at the request of Iran and allies in the Middle East, and that his decision was contingent on a proposed deal with Tehran being quickly agreed to. But today, the president made clear his patience is running thin, especially when it comes to the flow of oil export in the Strait of Hormuz.
This is the last chance. This is not something that, if it doesn't happen, this is the last chance for them to sign a good document. I'm not going to let them charge. If anybody's going to charge, we'll charge. We're the one that has total control. We have total control. We have a thing called a blockade with his Navy. And that Navy is, they call it a wall of steel, the United States wall of steel. And no, there's not going to be charging. We're not talking about charging at all. There won't be charging.
The president's announcement of new talks with Iran has oil prices sinking today, despite no indication that Iran was prepared to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Here with me now, the managing director of Clearview Energy Partners, Kevin Book. And Kevin, how is the oil industry viewing this plan by Iran and Oman to establish this safe temporary route, as they're calling it, for vessels through the strait?
Well, I think most operators in the region and those who work in the region, U.S. companies, foreign companies, don't want to pay more to travel through what would ordinarily be known as innocent passage through territorial waters adjacent to the countries that are proposing to charge fees. That would be a big change. They don't want to do it.
Okay, and then President Trump announcing plans to pause attacks on Iran. We see oil prices tumble 5%, 20%. Why does the oil market continue to believe that Trump, who CNN's David Goldman calls the president who cried peace, why does the oil market continue to react the way it does?
Well, there's a very important role that he plays in deciding whether or not there's going to be an attack. So we have very little information coming out of a war zone. The fog of war is thick. There's a lot of mystery And so you could track ships, you can look at fundamentals, but a very significant change of the order that the president had been discussing. The biggest attack since World War II could very easily disable a lot of capacity in the region. Reprisals could disable a lot of capacity. If he says it's off, the market sells off until it learns something else.
So does it react more so on words than action or inaction?
Well, fundamentals matter. There's a lot going on besides what the president says. So oil that doesn't come out of the Strait of Hormuz is a shortage, and that shortage drives up prices. But there's another shortage, a bigger shortage, a shortage of refined products, fuels, gasoline, diesel, the fuel we use. Now, one of the things that's happening is that the oil price isn't going up as much because the refineries that can't get the oil aren't using it. The fuels prices are going up more as a result. You see a divergence in these prices. So there's different prices that are responding in different ways. But look, we're not getting the volume out of the Strait of Hormuz that we were getting before the war. We're not getting the volume we were getting during the MOU days, which means that we're coming back on that moment when inventories are drawing and questions are arising.
Well, despite not having that volume coming out of the Strait, prices, the profits for oil companies is something that the president actually talked about just today, not long ago in the Oval Office. What did you make of those comments?
Well, it's been a recurrent theme. Secretary Bessent brought it up in April and said that, oil prices are falling, the gasoline and fuel prices should fall too. In June, the president said he wanted to see lower prices. He said it again today. The reality is that the industry isn't causing these prices to go up. Shortage is causing these prices to go up. That is what, in fact, the president said today. And so it is war that is behind this. Now, as for what goes on in the retail, there has never been any evidence found of systematic manipulation of prices at a retail level. And refineries are effectively price takers. And so they're buying crude oil at the global price and selling at sort of the commodity price of the fuels that they produce. So it's very difficult to understand how they could respond to this. But one of the things that they have been watching, that investors have been watching, is whether or not the administration would look at limiting exports, limiting the outflow of fuels from the United States to try to force those prices down. They have said that they wouldn't do that. They said that earlier this year. But as we go further into the summer with high prices, those questions are likely to come up again, Brian.
And we also have the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen warning they would target Saudi shipping in the Red Sea. So this has moved beyond just the Strait. What are the impacts there of a potential blockade?
Well, that's the exit valve for a lot of the crude that had been previously going through the Strait of Hormuz. So if the Houthis actually block cargoes going through the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that goes into the Gulf of Aden at the bottom of the Red Sea, then those cargoes at minimum have to go north through Suez. They have to offload, if they're large tankers, to the Sumed pipeline, which has pipeline capacity constraints of its own. And then they have to take the route all the way around Africa to get to the Asian markets they previously would have served in relatively short order through Bab el-Mandeb. So that's a pretty significant change if it happens.
And also in the Oval Office today, President Trump seemed to be irked by the profits of some of the oil companies. What did you make of those comments?
Well, it's consistent with what he'd been saying again in June and what the Secretary of the Treasury had been saying in April. The profits coincide with shortage. Oil companies don't usually get a lot of sympathy when they're experiencing significant losses at times of surplus. We as consumers tend to be pretty happy in those times, and we're not out there to complain about that. So it's cyclical. They make investments over the long haul. Prices go up and down, and their profits reflect that.
A CNN exclusive. Sources say the Pentagon is asking U.S. troops for creative and unconventional ideas to punish Iran, essentially crowdsourcing new ways to wage the war President Trump launched now in its 6th month. CNN's Zach Cohen helped break this story and is here now with details. So, Zach, what are you learning about this?
Yeah, sources telling me and our colleague Katie Bo-Lillis that the Pentagon is really trying to cast a wider net as it seeks fresh ideas for how to ramp up the pressure on Iran at this stage in the conflict, which we're told by multiple sources is not inherently a bad idea. This war was stated to only last about 6 weeks, and we're now in the 6th month of the war itself, which has really changed the calculus as far as military planners are concerned. We're told that the U.S. Central Command is really taking a look at its strategy as a whole and trying to reevaluate what it can do to try to push Iran to the negotiating table. And our sources are also saying there that this email, this crowdsourcing email, is a sign of the limited options that President Donald Trump has available to him at this point to try to get Iran to the table on his terms. And that's something that we've seen play out over the course of this conflict, whether it's concerns about the diminishing U.S. munitions stockpile, the fact that even Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, has acknowledged that airstrikes, air power, have their limitations. So these stated objectives that President Trump has laid out since the beginning of the conflict, preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and even reopening the Strait of Hormuz, has proven more challenging to accomplish with just military might alone. And we're seeing even now Donald Trump giving the Iranians one more chance to make some sort of an initial agreement over the Strait of Hormuz. But in the meantime, we do see military planners really trying to broaden the scope and solicit creative and unconventional ideas for how they can maybe handle the situation going forward.
Certainly an intriguing peek behind the curtain. Obviously, we've reached out to the military on this reporting. What are we hearing?
We reached out to U.S. Central Command about this reporting, and they responded saying, quote, U.S. Central Command has a long history of thinking and working in innovative ways. Admiral Cooper, who runs U.S. Central Command in particular, reaches out to members of our great team, regardless of rank, to achieve the highest levels of operational performance possible. And I want to note, too, that this email was sent just days before President Trump threatened to escalate the conflict. And we know we've talked a lot about concerns that he has heard from his top advisors about what the potential consequences and the potential lack of effectiveness of that escalatory strikes would be. So it's all not happening in a vacuum, but more creative thinking is being encouraged, not just by the senior leaders in the military, but also lower ranks as well.
Tonight, President Trump says he is giving Iran one last chance to sign a deal at the request of America's Gulf allies.
Many countries called, the leaders of many are friendly with a lot of them. Almost all of them, one way or the other, and they all wanted to give this a last chance. This is a last chance. This is not something that, if it doesn't happen, this is a last chance for them to sign a good document.
The president's tone has shifted back and forth multiple times over the last several days. First, he said the two sides had reached the parameters of a deal. After Tehran denied engaging in talks, he accused them this morning of being, quote, extremely duplicitous. Now he seems optimistic once again, suggesting the Strait of Hormuz could open as soon as Tuesday. Kevin Liptak is at the White House. And Kevin, I wonder, the president says one last chance, but as you well know, this is not the first of the deadlines he's issued over the last several weeks and months. Do they back that up? I mean, is he putting any sort of time frame on this?
There's no time frame. In fact, he said specifically that he felt no pressure, including from the midterm elections. So he's not putting a deadline on any of this. We do know, of course, that the military has prepared for this escalation. They've flowed resources to the region, and they say that they're ready for a go order if the president is to give it. But at this point, he is holding off. I think it's interesting to just parse what he's saying is under discussion here. He's saying that there's discussions between the Iranians to try and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That would be phase one. And phase two would be a discussion of the nuclear program. If that sounds very, very familiar, it's because he's describing almost exactly the memorandum of understanding that he signed at the Palace of Versailles in June, and that he essentially ripped up 2 weeks later, saying that it wasn't even worth the paper that it was printed on. Part of the reason he didn't think it was working is because he didn't think the Iranians were negotiating in good faith. And now he seems to be trying to put in place exactly the same thing with exactly the same Iranians who he still thinks are negotiating in bad faith. So where all of this leads, it's not particularly clear. And it's not even particularly clear where President Trump thinks that it leads, except to some sort of resolution of the conflict. Now, he did hold out the option that this escalation could occur. He called it decapitation. But he said he didn't want to necessarily go down that route because he was worried that it would kill a lot of people. And that does match what we've heard behind the scenes, advisors warning about the potential for civilian casualties. They've obviously also been warning about the prospects of dwindling munitions stockpiles, which I think is a concern not just for the United States, but for the entire region, you know, as the Saudis, as the Emiratis, the Jordanians, Iranians, the Bahrainis, as they all look at potential retaliation from Iran if the president goes this route, they recognize that the American ability to defend them is also dependent on those munition stockpiles. And so there are a lot of reasons, I think, for the president to hold off here that he was talking about with his advisors all last week. But at least for now, he's allowing the diplomacy continue. But he says this may result in some announcement on the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow. But in terms of a broader agreement that would bring the conflict to an end permanently, it doesn't seem as if we're any closer to that than we were before.
Yeah, and let's be frank, there have been promises about the Strait of Hormuz before. So far, none of them have become a reality. Kevin Liptak at the White House. Well, Iran's strategy of countering U.S. military might with economic pain has exposed a new target in the region, AI data centers. The centers have become critical to the economy and national security of several Gulf nations, and they are often owned by top U.S. tech companies. Iran has now struck several of them, and the U.S. has responded by striking one in Iran. David Goldman is with me now. David, it's an interesting target, right? Because we think of the Gulf as in effect being a one industry region, right? Oil, energy, natural gas, etc. But more and more, it's a tech hub, and these are now economic targets for Iran.
That's right. They're trying to change that, and they're really doubling, tripling down on AI, and Iran has made those a target. I mean, they have targeted 2 data centers in Bahrain. The United States, as you mentioned, targeted 1 in Tehran. The UAE has gotten hit, and so now there are 5 data centers that have been targeted in this war. The Bahrain one is particularly interesting because they were hit twice. First, Iran targeted it close to the beginning of the war on April 30th, and then it said it wasn't done. And just a few weeks ago, July 21st, there was a subsequent attack that basically demolished these Amazon facilities that are in Bahrain. So it's not just Amazon, it's lots of tech companies. Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palantir, all of these are Iranian targets according to the regime. They've actually outlined 29 different targets. They said that these are all legitimate military targets. And why are they legitimate military targets? Well, it's because so many of these companies do have military contracts. In fact, there's a $9 billion military contract that Google and Microsoft and Oracle and Amazon are all participating in. And so they don't differentiate between, in these data centers, whether they're holding U.S. military information or commercial information for things like ChatGPT and other similar AI services for consumers. Those are all held in the same place. Iran says you might as well be putting a big American flag on your roof. They are targets that we can hit. And this is crucial for the Gulf nations because they are all massively investing in AI to differentiate their economies from oil. To your point, we have, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, all of these countries have dedicated a combined $2 trillion in U.S. investments to the exclusion of China, saying that we will invest in your architecture and infrastructure, and we will not invest in China. We'll create a third hub in addition to China and Silicon Valley so that investors can put their money here. The big question is, if they're going to be military targets, are companies going to continue to build there? Will insurers continue to insure them? And, will they be able to live this dream, Jim?
David Goldman, another vulnerability. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Speaking of AI, a major cybersecurity firm is warning that hackers are moving faster than ever by weaponizing AI. The 2026 Threat Hunting Report by CrowdStrike looks at activity over the past 12 months, ending in June, and it has found that attacks now need to be measured in minutes, not days. CrowdStrike found one campaign that generated almost 200,000 automated requests to an AI system in just 2 minutes, and hackers are targeting the very software and AI tools that businesses rely on most. Adam Myers is CrowdStrike's Senior Vice President of Counter-Adversary Operations. His team tracks criminal, state-sponsored, and national cyber attackers around the world. Adam, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, everybody's using AI, including the bad guys, as you make the point here. Let's begin with how AI helps? Because your report says AI is a tool, a target, and a force multiplier. Explain.
Yeah, absolutely. The enterprises are rushing to adopt AI, and we've seen all of the benefits that come from implementing AI across the business to help make things go faster, improve results, get things to customers faster, easier. But adversaries are using AI to also increase speed and to make their jobs easier. We find more and more scripts that are being used by these threat actors to hack into organizations. And we could tell from the scripts that they were written with AI because they're well documented. They have emojis in many cases in the comments, and they're much higher fidelity than they had previously been. And of course, we also have AI being targeted. And so that's one of the big challenges we've seen.
You have warned in the past, going back to March, about Iran taking advantage of AI for cyber attacks. At the time, you mentioned specifically the financial services sector, but now you have these attacks on infrastructure here in the U.S. in 6 states, including water systems, and Iran is one of the suspects in that. Do you see Iran as weaponizing AI for cyber attacks?
Not as much in terms of weaponizing AI. I think the Iranian groups that we've been tracking have increased activity, certainly since the start of the conflict, or the escalation of the conflict, I should say. And I think with these alleged water incidents, this is something we've seen from them before. About a year and a half ago, they targeted a water treatment facility in Pennsylvania and had got access to what we call operational technology systems. These are systems that are used to move things around or increase or decrease the flow of water or pipes, gas pipelines or things like that. And these are systems that should not be connected to the internet. And in previous incidents, we've seen them using default passwords and things like that to gain access.
You mentioned other state actors that do specifically take advantage of AI, including China and North Korea. I mean, they were already formidable players in cyberspace. How much more formidable has this made them?
Well, we see North Korean threat actors literally every day. I think in July, we saw something like 41 incidents of North Koreans using AI in every step of the way to gain jobs, remote IT jobs at Western companies, particularly here in the US. And what that looks like is they use AI to create LinkedIn profiles and resumes to make them attractive to recruiters. We see them using AI during the interview process to answer questions and even change their appearance using deep fake technology. And then finally, using AI to do the job once they gain that employment. All of that meant to generate revenue that goes directly to the weapons program in North Korea. Yeah. On China, we've seen that they're using AI for vulnerability research. And we've seen, and this report details, that China has fielded new vulnerabilities as weapons within 2 days of those vulnerabilities being released, and even as quick as 24 hours. Many organizations have kind of standardized on a 30-day patch cycle. And that's completely obsolete in what we found since really the beginning of this year and the increase in the vulnerability speed. This is something that's a huge challenge for organizations. They need to patch in 24 to 48 hours, not 30 days.
Okay. Now, even before the rapid acceleration of AI, the cyberspace was, as I don't have to tell you, extremely active, and a lot of attacks worked. I just wonder, is AI making existing cyber protections, which were already vulnerable and full of holes, if not obsolete, just much more vulnerable?
No, I think that's actually the good news story, is that we've been implementing AI, and many other companies from a defense perspective have been using AI as a force multiplier. And you mentioned that a few minutes ago. As AI allows security teams to make decisions faster, to keep pace with the adversary, it's actually really helpful. Where we need to be very careful, and one of the things we call out in this report is with AI, specifically something called CI/CD pipelines, or continuous integration, continuous deployment, meaning that as code is being pushed by developers, that gets instantly sucked down and implemented by these systems. And we've seen an increase in supply chain attacks. In fact, in just one day, we saw over 300 supply chain attacks against various dependencies that are being used across that AI ecosystem. So that's a big blind spot that I think organizations are not well aware of.
Right now, President Trump is once again lashing out at Iran just hours before planned talks with the regime. In a new social media post, he called Iran's leadership duplicitous for asking for the talks and then denying the discussions. He said, nothing gets through to Iran unless we want it to, and nothing will get through unless a deal or total surrender is accomplished. He also reiterated his goal of Iran never having a nuclear weapon. With us here in the Situation Room, CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier and Michael Allen. He's a former special assistant to President George W. Bush for national security. Kim, what do you make, first of all, of the president's latest social media post?
Well, he doesn't like getting called out by the Iranians, who are saying we're in talks with Oman, but not with the United States. This is something that they have consistently stuck to since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed in June, saying that they have not agreed to talks with Washington. So what we have is, once again, we're stuck in Groundhog Day, where President Trump threatens massive strikes, and then we hear Gulf allies intervene because they know whatever strikes the U.S. metes out on Tehran, Tehran has promised to do the same to the much closer Gulf allies. And the allies, they don't want their energy infrastructure, et cetera, hit, and their people are tired of this constant barrage.
Does Iran, Michael, have a serious interest right now in actually finding a diplomatic solution?
I don't think they do. I don't think that they feel like they're in a disadvantageous position right now. I think they feel like they control most of the straits. There are other vessels slipping through the Oman side of the Strait of Hormuz. But in general, I feel like they have a pretty good grip on it. They're not going to negotiate away any leverage that they may have. But there is an X factor, and that is, what is the state of the Iranian economy? We know inflation is 70%. We know that they're in dire straits. But are they so bad off? And I'm not sure we know for sure, nor even the CIA and our intelligence communities, how bad off they are. And if they're in a really horrific position, they may want to negotiate over time to get that blockade going back, but it's hard to say. It's kind of the X factor in an assessment of their attitude.
Over the weekend, Trump posted he was going to launch the largest, most serious military assault of any time since World War II against Iran, but now he's backed off of that once again. The Saudi Crown Prince, as you know, appealed to President Trump to hold Saudi Arabia, including its oil operations. How much sway do the Saudis and other regional allies have right now on the president at this moment? The United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait.
I think they have a lot of influence over the president. He puts a lot of stock in personal relationships, maybe too much. But I think what the president's overriding objective is to keep oil prices low. That tells me he does care about the outcome of the midterm elections. And so every time he seems to be thinking, I'm going to go more kinetic, or I'm going to do the blockade more than I'm currently doing it, he seems to back down a little bit because he wants to be able to press the markets into a more favorable position. It's great for, I guess, our oil prices here in the United States, but it's terrible strategic messaging for our adversary, the Iranians, who just see an irresolute United States lurching back and forth into positions that honestly not many people can understand or track.
Kim Dozier, is it possible that Iran could be overplaying its hand?
At this point, you know, Iran has several weeks, if not months, before it's going to feel the same kind of economic pain that forced it into signing that Memorandum of Understanding. At this point, it still has capacity to fill up its oil storage areas. It's still getting some oil out. And unlike Donald Trump, it doesn't care about how the public reacts to rising prices, et cetera. And most of all, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does not want to hand Donald Trump a win, especially ahead of the midterms. They know how important that is. And that's why I think you're going to see them draw this out, at least through that time period. They can go for a while before they start having trouble buying new ammunition, et cetera.
You know, Iran has continued to strike against U.S. and allied targets in the region, big time. Are they getting fresh supplies of weapons from somewhere, or do they still have a deep stockpile?
I think they have some, but I think they also use the pauses in fighting to restock their arsenal. I think we're pretty confident that the Chinese are absolutely sending them, at the very least, dual-use products, probably actual military equipment. And we saw recently that the Russians still have a healthy relationship with Iran. Of course, Ukraine sunk a ship, so we all looked at that, and that reminded us of that relationship. But there's other equipment that gets through. They have a very thick relationship. So I think that not only do they have drones and ballistic missiles buried somewhere that they can use more or less on demand, I think they have more stuff coming in.
And to Michael's point, they don't have to hit with conventional military capability. They are masters at the asymmetric attacks with, we don't know what that explosion was in Damietta in that Egyptian port. There was another explosion near a ship in the Strait of Hormuz today. Nobody claimed that, probably Iran. They only have to do these minor attacks to frustrate major shipping because insurance companies aren't going to insure traffic through something so dangerous because even one strike has the potential to take out a multi-million-dollar vessel. That is an advantage that the U.S. does not have.
Kimberly Dozier, Michael Allen, to both of you, thank you very, very much. This morning, the war with Iran has exposed a major vulnerability in one of the world's most vital interests, AI data centers.
CNN Business senior reporter David Goldman joins us now for part of our Decoding AI series. So, David, how vulnerable are these data centers?
They're very vulnerable, and I think Iran is proving that over the course of this war. There were attacks in Bahrain, there was an attack in Tehran, there were attacks in the UAE, 5 confirmed data center attacks just over the course of the last few months, and this exposes these data centers as sitting ducks in a war. I mean, just look at Bahrain. This is the Amazon data center that was attacked twice. First, on April 30th, we had that initial attack, and Iran said, we're not done, we're going to hit it again. Just a few weeks ago, there was a second attack on these facilities. Amazon now has a basically destroyed data center in a region that is increasingly critical for AI. We'll get to that in a minute. But, you know, these targets aren't exclusive to Amazon. Also, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palantir, all of these are targets according to Iran. They actually said that there are 29 different targets around the region for U.S.-backed data centers. This is becoming an increasing problem. The reason that Iran says that these are all targets is because they are doing business with the U.S. military. So a number of these companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they are all part of a $9 billion military contract that goes through the end of 2028. And they're saying, well, you don't differentiate between military data that's stored in these data centers and commercial data like AI, you know, ChatGPT, that kind of thing in the data centers, and they make them legitimate targets. That's according to Iran. Now, the Gulf states have a say in all of this too. They have invested $2 trillion in U.S.-backed data centers in this region. Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Oman, all of those countries have said that they want U.S. data centers. They have a lot of money to spend on this. They want to become a kind of third choice between Silicon Valley and China. As this develops, this is going to be an increasingly important situation to watch, because if these data centers are sitting ducks and they're just attacked, well, then there's a new front in the war that needs protection, because these are critical infrastructure, not only for the Gulf region, but also for the United States.
Right, Palestinian sources tell CNN the White House wants Israel to stop its attacks on Gaza.
The second hour of World World starts right now.
A definite ramp up in Israeli attacks over the weekend. It came, only hours after President Trump announced what he described as a historic agreement.
Israel says they will continue to thwart any threat from Gaza. Homes are being leveled, families are being evacuated, and fires are expected to burn for weeks. Now, a little bit of good weather could make an impact. And later, a return to the pitch. Jason Sudeikis on Ted Lasso's new challenges in the hit show's 4th season. All right, coming to you live from New York, I'm Zain Hasha.
And I'm Bianca Goldrigo. You're watching the second hour of One World. Iran says that it has no plans to hold talks with the U.S., despite President Trump's claim that negotiations would resume today.
Yeah, speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One on Sunday, Trump said he called off a massive attack on Tehran, saying progress was being made on a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and end Iran's nuclear threat. Just one day earlier, the president vowed to hit Iran hard until its leadership couldn't take any more. Just a few minutes ago, though, Trump again took to social media, lashing out at the Iranian regime and casting doubt on its ability to strike a deal.
Tehran, meanwhile, says that it is holding discussions with Oman on a new temporary route through the Strait of Hormuz.
As Israel intensifies its strikes in Gaza, the top diplomat overseeing the Board of Peace is slamming the deadly attacks and urging de-escalation. A source says that Nikolai Mladenov met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today to discuss an agreement announced by President Trump last week that would disarm Hamas and lead to the phased Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
And while Israel has not publicly responded, one official says the IDF will not retreat from its current line in Gaza. And Hamas says it will only comply if Israel halts its fire. Israeli strikes killed 28 people in Gaza over the weekend. The IDF says that it was targeting Hamas commanders. Well, officials estimate more than 1,200 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes since the October ceasefire. CNN's Jeremy Diamond joins us now live in Tel Aviv. So much was made about optimism when this deal was announced on Friday. A lot of skepticism, too, given the players, specifically that Hamas said that it would lay down its arms. Now there appears to be a game of chicken in terms of who blinks first. Jeremy, what are the Israelis saying?
Yeah, well, Bianca, on Friday, as you know, when this agreement was announced and came to light, Hamas started talking about it in very clear terms, where they said, yes, we've agreed for the first time to this plan that would see Hamas relinquish their weapons. But at the same time, they also made clear that they were only going to begin this process of disarming if Israel first carried out a series of its own obligations under this ceasefire agreement, namely stopping the near daily Israeli strikes that we have seen in Gaza since this ceasefire began back in October. And instead, what we saw from the Israeli military over the weekend was a very clear ramp up in attacks on the Gaza Strip. At least 28 people were killed, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, by these Israeli strikes since President Trump announced this deal in the early hours of Friday morning local time here. And the Israeli military said that in these strikes, it was targeting Hamas commanders and militants, including some who were involved in the October 7th attack on Israel. Today, what we've been seeing is a diplomatic effort to try and bring Israel back into compliance with this agreement. Nikolai Mladenov, the High Representative for Gaza on the Board of Peace, who works very closely with the U.S. administration, he met with the Israeli Prime Minister today, and I'm told by a source that Mladenov was there to speak to the Prime Minister about implementing this deal going forward, and included in that was a request for him to stop these Israeli strikes that we have been seeing in Gaza. Now, it's important to note that we haven't seen any additional strikes in Gaza since yesterday evening, and so the question is, was this ramp up something that the Israelis were doing in order to carry out several additional strikes before they would agree to the halt that the U.S. and the Board of Peace are asking them to, or is this simply more more of Israel defying this ceasefire agreement going forward. We will get the answer to that in the days and weeks ahead. But it is important to note that amid this meeting between the Prime Minister and Nikolai Mladenov, the High Representative for Gaza, an Israeli official told reporters today that Israel would continue to thwart any threats that it sees in Gaza, and also that Israel would not withdraw from the current yellow line, meaning where the yellow line stands now after Israel seized additional territory beyond what was agreed to in that October ceasefire agreement. So a very, very delicate situation, and one that U.S. and Board of Peace officials anticipated would be quite difficult even after securing this agreement with Hamas following months and months of negotiations. They know that what lies ahead is going to be even more difficult, even trickier to accomplish, but that is the task at hand. Bianna?
Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv for us. Thank you.
All right, let's take a closer look at the situation in Gaza with Gaith Al-Amadi. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's been an advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and is a former Palestinian negotiator, and joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Gaith, thank you so much for being with us. So just talk to us about where things go from here, because we have a situation whereby Hamas is only agreeing to disarm if, of course, Israel stops any sort of future additional strikes. And at the same time, the Israeli military essentially saying they're not going to withdraw from Gaza at all unless Hamas disarms. So where do things go from here? I mean, this is a very sort of tricky, complicated thing to achieve here.
I mean, let me start maybe with the positive. I think the agreement itself is significant because the whole process since signing the ceasefire last October has been stuck. So this is injecting some diplomatic energy. However, we have two sets of problems here. The first set is, frankly, neither Israel nor Hamas want to implement their part. So how can you diplomatically push them in that direction? And the second set of problems is, even if there's diplomatic will, the reality on the ground just doesn't yet support implementation of this. You know, the deal asks for an international force to come in. The only number we have right now is 200. That's meaningless. But more importantly, it asks for 5,000 Palestinian soldiers to come in. And none of those soldiers has yet been recruited or trained. So we have a lot of challenges, but at least we see movement where just a few days ago, things were completely stuck.
Gaith, it's, I guess, a bit refreshing to start the show with some optimism. Typically that comes from Zain and myself, but it's great that it's coming from a guest who knows more of these players than even we do here. As it relates to what you just mentioned, and that is the international force that at some point would be coming in and overseeing affairs in Gaza, it has long been understood that they would never agree to something like this, and most of these would be Arab and Muslim countries that would be sending their peacekeepers unless Hamas disarms as well. So where is their position in all of this? Has anything changed on that front?
Not really. I mean, when I talk about 200 people committed, they're mainly from Morocco. And if you look at the details, they actually are saying, yes, we're committing, but we're not going to go in and disarm Hamas. We might stay around the perimeter, etc. So this is all maybe diplomatic speak. But unless we see a real progress on Hamas disarmament, it's very hard to see how any external actors will come in. On the other hand, Hamas is saying we're willing to disarm, but Israel has to meet its own obligations. And Hamas knows that Israel right now is an election season. They're going to have an election, I think, October 27th, and unlikely to move on any of these fronts. This is where I think today, the meeting that Mladenov, the Board of Peace envoy with Netanyahu, is very important. Because we need to see sustained pressure on the Israelis to do their part, but also on Hamas. And pressure on Hamas has to come through pressuring their supporters, mainly in Qatar and Turkey. So a lot of complicated diplomacy ahead of us.
I mean, it's interesting because you answered my my next question, but I'd like you to expand, because this idea of sort of pressuring the Israelis to do their part is, as you point out, going to be very difficult, given that it's an election season for Israel, an election in October. Netanyahu faces a tough re-election battle. He's supposed to be the sort of security prime minister. And also, there's going to be a lot of pressure within Israel from his right-wing coalition parties who really want to make sure that the pressure is kept up on Hamas and, of course, on Hezbollah as well. So how does that resolve itself?
It's hard to see how it resolves itself. Partly because it's not only, by the way, the right-wing members of his coalition. Just a few minutes ago, two of their ministers said they want to re-vote on this issue. So we're seeing that pressure. But also his opposition. I mean, his key opposition figure, Gadi Eisenkot, political moderate, but a security hawk, came out against it and said this is going to keep Hamas in power. Now, Netanyahu, though, this is one set of pressures. But the other set of pressures is coming from President Trump, because Netanyahu just does not want to say no to President Trump. He does not want to go on his bad side. Yes, President Trump's popularity in Israel has diminished recently. Yet for Netanyahu, there's a lot of political cost in going for that fight. I suspect what we will see, Netanyahu trying to thread the needle. I mean, uncharacteristically, by the way, Netanyahu has said nothing as of yet about this directly. He's going to try to thread the needle, hoping that Hamas will save him by doing something outrageous and maybe excusing any of his actions.
Well, Netanyahu, I don't think, has said anything after President Trump seemingly put words in his mouth, surprising him with that announcement over the weekend that the United States would not be attacking Iran, even though it did seem as though Israel, at least, was planning that the United States would. But as it relates to Gaza, what we've seen from this administration time and time again are sort of these big announcements, a lot of optimism surrounding them, and not much follow-up. What do you expect to see now to make sure that this case perhaps is an outlier? Does it need to be the appointment of one point person who will be in charge of all of this? Because between Israel and Hamas, I can't imagine you think this is going to work itself out between them.
Absolutely. You need an American, senior American who is fully in charge of following the day-to-day implementation of this. Today, we don't have anyone like this in the U.S. system. Yes, you have Steve Witkoff, but he is very sporadic. You need someone who's doing it day-to-day, because without that, I have a lot of respect for Nikolai Mladenov. He is probably one of the most accomplished diplomats I have ever dealt with. Yet, without having clear, direct American support, there's only so much Mladenov can do. So if we don't have an American in charge, it's hard to see how this is going to continue. And by the way, this is not only a problem when it comes to Gaza. I mean, I think there's a larger image problem for the U.S. in the region. Big announcement, no follow-through. If we don't follow through on this one, I fear that the American standing and effectiveness in the whole region will further diminish.
All right, threats followed by reversals. More now on our top story. The U.S. president calling off what he says would have been a massive attack on Iran. Donald Trump claims peace talks between Washington and Tehran will resume in the coming hours. Iran says that there are no negotiations due to take place with the U.S., but it is in talks with Oman to establish a temporary corridor for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This is Iranian state media report. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke with senior Saudi and Pakistani officials Sunday night, and President Trump just posted on social media writing that nothing gets through to Iran unless we want it to, and nothing will get through unless a deal or total surrender is accomplished. In his latest piece for CNN, Stephen Collinson writes, as he wrestles with the monumental and the absurd, Trump forgets what voters actually want. Stephen joins us live now from Washington. So within this social media post that my producers just read to me during the commercial break, you had essentially Donald Trump admitting that the Iranians are actually only going to be discussing with Oman at this point, that perhaps there might not necessarily be negotiations taking place today after all. And we are used to this sort of seesaw, this whiplash, Stephen. On the one hand, you have the U.S. president saying, listen, I was planning to attack Iran, but I'm not going to. I'm going to de-escalate because there are going to be talks, and then inevitably something happens to derail those talks. This is exactly what a lot of us were predicting. Just take us through what we actually know so far about whether or not there are going to be negotiations taking place between the U.S. and Iran.
Yeah, there's been some reporting this morning that the U.S. was involved in those talks with Oman. That seems to be ruled out by the president in this post. I think what this Truth Social post shows is strategic confusion, frustration, the fact that Iran seems to be calling all the shots in this showdown with a far more powerful country, the United States, and that the president has got himself into a situation in a war that he started, which still, as we go into the 6th month, doesn't seem to have a way out that will either fulfill his goals when he started the war or be palatable to him politically or diplomatically. He starts off that post by saying that Iran and its leaders are duplicitous. That's exactly what Iran has been saying about the United States, not just in the way that Trump often breaks off diplomacy and then tries to use military force to coerce it to surrender. But some people I've talked to who've been talking to people in Iran basically argue that Iran now believes that there's not a great deal of point in diplomacy because anything that it agrees to will be countermanded by the president's volatility. And so basically we're in a situation which it would have been hard to countenance before this war, that Iran's word seems to be just as good as the president of the United States' word. And I think that tells you a lot about American foreign policy at this moment.
Yeah, that is such a good point. So we are in August now, right? We've only got a few months left until the midterms. This appears to me to be a sort of fork in the road moment whereby if the war was to end in the next couple of weeks and perhaps America is deemed as the most successful party, I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but for argument's sake, you could argue that there is enough time for voters to put it behind them and sort of forgive this is a president that did say no new wars, etc. But perhaps there's enough time where the voters might be distracted in terms of focusing on other issues, and this will be sort of relegated to the past. As you get into September and October, Stephen, it becomes a lot more tricky. I mean, the president has a very narrow window to end this war before it does really start to have an effect on the midterms.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of political science literature that points out that voters tend to make up their minds who they're going to vote for in November over the course of the summer. And it's quite hard after that, especially in a midterm election where you don't have big events like presidential debates, to change the narrative. Obviously, Iran understands that as well. They've shown themselves to be quite shrewd during this war in trying to build political and economic pressure on Trump. Perhaps they're believing that the president will climb down because he's so desperate to get this war over. The problem, I think, is that if this blockade, the U.S. blockade and the effective Iranian control of the Strait continue for much longer, you're then going to see some of the really serious consequences build that didn't happen when the war was put on hold the first time. A lot of oil reserves are quite depleted around the world. We're getting closer to the European winter. Those countries in Europe don't keep typically a lot of natural gas in reserves, so they're quite affected by the volatility of supply and prices. So that could build economic pressure. If the high gasoline prices in the United States continue through September and October, that's just going to make the president's argument that he's made everyone's lives better economically more difficult domestically. So all of these pressures are building. So you can understand why that frustration is coming through Trump's Truth Social post. But how to get out of this absolute mess doesn't seem any more clear now than it did 3 months ago.
So what are the wins? Because that is going to have to be his focus. I mean, just like any president during the midterms, he has to focus on this idea of, look, my party has made your life better over the past 2 years or so. What are the wins that he's going to focus on? I mean, obviously, I imagine that immigration is going to be one of them, but just take us through what the president is going to be touting here.
Yeah, and he often talks about how he's secured the southern border. That is true. The problem is on immigration, some of his harsher deportation tactics have started to turn away some voters who turned to him on immigration 2 years ago. Seems to have weakened his support among critical Hispanic communities in some battleground states as well. One of the problems is Trump doesn't really concentrate that much on the wins that he has. He doesn't talk that much about higher than expected tax rebates that a lot of people got this year because of his economic policies. The Trump RX website, which is designed to lower prescription drug prices in a fairly limited but still genuine way. He argues that because the stock market is soaring, or has been, that America is in a golden economic age and everyone is feeling great. The problem is that the evidence of most people's lives with higher prices, it's very difficult to get housing for many people, for younger people to get on the housing ladder. Grocery prices are still high. All of those things play into this fact that people are not feeling economically secure. And after all, they brought President Trump back into office, many voters in those key battleground states that he won over Kamala Harris, because they thought that he would bring down prices and strengthen the daily economy rather than the bigger economy as reflected in the markets and everything else. So there's a feeling, I think, that the president hasn't delivered on his policies in 2024, and that is at the root of his problems. And the Iran war, with all the extra economic consequences that it's causing, is only compounding those issues, threatening higher inflation and higher prices and gas prices and everything else, which a lot of people feel.
Iran's foreign ministry denies that any talks with the U.S. are currently taking place and says that Tehran is in discussions with Oman over a temporary safe route through the Strait of Hormuz. That comes after just hours after U.S. President Donald Trump told journalists aboard Air Force One that negotiations would, in fact, resume today.
They said, we'd like to make a deal. Now, I don't know what they say, because a lot of times they'll say that to me and then they'll go out and say, we don't know what he's talking about. Obviously, they don't want to be attacked. And they knew the extent of the attack.